Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. Niaga Spotlight takes us through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Now today on Analysis, our spotlight falls on COP30 and ASEAN, looking at sustainability data and prioritizing it in particular. Now following the tail end of COP30 in Belém, Brazil, where the global climate conversation is shifting from ambition to execution. At last year's COP29 in Baku, developed nations committed to mobilize at least $300 billion per year by 2035 for developing countries and to work towards a broader goal of $1.3 trillion annually in external climate finance by the same year. For ASEAN, the stakes have never been higher. The region needs roughly $3 trillion of infrastructure investment by 2030 to build climate-resilient growth models. Weak sustainability disclosures and fragmented reporting systems are no longer so-called back-office issues. They are investment risk issues. In a moment, I'll be speaking with Sharath Martin, Senior Policy Consultant at ACCA Asia Pacific and also trustee of both WWF Malaysia and the SHIFT project. He's been tracking the region's move from reporting as compliance to reporting as more of a credibility perspective. And today we'll zero in on how ASEAN businesses could be evolving in the new climate finance era. A very good morning, Sharath. How are you doing today?
Good. Sorry, I forgot your name.
So, Sharath, let's move on into the discussion itself. Now, COP30 has stalled on scaling climate finance from $300 billion to about $1.3 trillion a year. From an ACCA and investor readiness perspective, what level of disclosure quality must ASEAN companies look at being able to demonstrate?
Thank you, Tamina. I'm glad you raised the point about stalling because I think what we need to also appreciate is there has been a stalling or a scale back in EU. For example, very recently the EU Parliament has decided that more than or close to 95% of its companies would no longer have to report under their CSRD, which is Corporate Responsibility Sustainability Reporting Directive.
Right.
Now, against that light, and then in US, they've pulled completely out of the Paris Agreement.
Exactly.
A lot of ASEAN businesses, including Malaysian businesses, are asking, then why should we? Are we being too aggressive? So maybe let's deal with that question. Right?
Where's the leadership, quote unquote?
And I think there is an economic perspective to what should drive us. So a few facts. Firstly, we are expected to be the fourth largest economy by 2030. We've got about 670 or more people in ASEAN, a major trading region, and the third largest labor force outside India and China. So it's in our fundamental interests how we look at this issue. Now, what are the kinds of climate risks we probably will face? So according to some studies, Philippines and Indonesia are #1 and #2, followed by Myanmar in terms of most affected by major natural disasters caused by climate change, right? That's #1. #2, another study, and this is actually by a sort of leading reinsurer called Swiss Re, expects that we might lose up to 35% of our GDP due to the sustainability risks. So I think it is important that
35%. Right. Anything that goes above, the 1/3 mark, it should make everyone sit up in shock and take action.
Indeed. And so I think this is why we need to realize that in ASEAN and in Malaysia, we have to do what is right because it's in our interest. It's not about dovetailing the requirements of another region. And you very rightly called out the fact that the climate finance doesn't seem to be coming in. What does this point to? That we're going to have to fund ourselves out of this problem ourselves. The money is not really going to come from all those places that we have expected and seen before in decades past. ASEAN, Asia is going to have to start to look at how it's going to fund these problems ourselves.
So we're clearly looking at, well, this brave new world at the tail end of 2025. Now, ACCA's own research as well, Sharath, as you mentioned, is warning of that 35% of ASEAN's GDP. So where do you see these biggest reporting blind spots? Let's talk a little bit more about them in detail.
Yeah. So I think it'll be helpful to understand and maybe contextualize where ASEAN is in terms of adopting something that we call this Global Sustainability Reporting Standard. It goes by the name of ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board has issued these standards. Now, let me roll off a few of these country names that have already adopted the standard in ASEAN. Indonesia just decided to adopt it in July. Thailand, I believe it was only last month, in October. Malaysia and Singapore were one of the first few to do so. And I think Philippines, they're going through a bit of a sort of legislative regulatory overhaul. And as they do that, they plan to do the same, right? Now, if you collect these countries, they represent about 85% of ASEAN's GDP.
Exactly.
Right?
So I think it's looking pretty positive if you just look at which of the major ASEAN economies are already committed or in the process of just ratifying and harmonizing their local legislation.
Right.
So that would be talking about the transition risk in a little bit of a while. How about let's looking at value chain emissions as well, Scope 3. Now that's something which both regulators as well as industry stakeholders are quite sensitive around.
Yeah. No, I want to address the point that you raised, which you used the word blind spot. And I think one of the, because from our conversations with various stakeholders, I would say the issue is less around the physical risk or the transition risk per se, but rather interestingly, it's the blind spot that many boards and C-suites are looking at sustainability reporting primarily as a compliance-driven issue.
A box-ticking mechanism.
And they're getting concerned because of all these regulator-driven initiatives. What the blind spot is, they fail to see that actually this is a fundamental and long-term business issue. And that's how they should be viewing these disclosures that they need to start looking at. Because it's going to tell them, are they going to lose their competitive advantage? When? And how are they going to pivot around these issues? And that's a major issue, Tamina, because a lot of them, I think some of them are even trying to speak to the regulators about relaxing and loosening some of these regulations. But it connects
delaying
to
them, etc.
Right. Yeah. And it connects to my earlier point, right? Sustainability risks are so embedded in our economy. We're going to be faced with it. We're not going to get all these buttresses and financing that we think we might. We're going to have to raise it on our own. And so how are you going to raise financing, whether from the capital market or from your bankers, if you don't have credible, high-quality sustainability disclosures? Can I give you one more little example?
Absolutely.
Today, if you wanted to go to the bank or if you wanted to go and raise money in the capital market, you need good quality financial reporting. Things are audited. And in fact, it's not just the financiers. If you've got a key customer or a key supplier, they often want to know what your financial health is.
All those prerequisites, yes?
It's a given. It's a given and it's been around for decades. I think going forward, people will want to know, for the same reasons, are you going to be around? Because if you're going to be around, then I want to do business with you. If your trajectory looks a bit wonky, then I'm not sure if I want to
invest in you, yes,
or go somewhere else, right? So have we started to see these shifts? It's only just begun, I would say, because honestly, we're in the first year of reporting cycle for places like Malaysia and Singapore, right? So maybe ask me this question a year from now and I'll tell you how people have responded to it. But just also let's help the audience to understand that sustainability disclosures are not completely new. There have been other frameworks around and voluntarily a lot of organizations have been doing it. What's different is now the regulators have decided, and this is part of a movement with G20, G7 and all of that, that we need to start making these things mandatory. That's where
mandatory versus voluntary.
Yeah.
Got you on that. Now, that brings up another little question, which I would really like to get your thoughts on. So you've mentioned the big ASEAN economies that are on track, and insofar it's acceptable, the pace at which it's going.
Yeah.
But the rest of the region, though, Sharath, is still building basic capacity. Now, what is the economic cost of this quote-unquote two-speed ASEAN framework when it comes to sustainability reporting?
Right. No, it's a great question. So I want to wind us back a little bit to the fact that if we've got these 4 or 5 economies which constitute about 85% of ASEAN, I think that takes away the risk of a two-speed economy in ASEAN, because by and large, they're pretty much following the same set of reporting standards and sustainability. And they are major economies, right? So the value chain impact would be brought along. Of course, there's Vietnam, and we've got to deal with Vietnam because it's also a major part of the supply chain. But I would be less worried about the two-speed effect. But to go back to another word that you use around capacity building, yes, that is a major area that needs to be focused on. It needs to be focused on by even people in my space who are accountants and finance professionals, because we need to apply the same kind of thinking, rigor, and mindset to how we do financial reporting with sustainability reporting.
Correct.
We need ecosystem providers who are doing valuation work, who are looking at the quality of data.
And perhaps maybe even some more reporting around supply chain exclusion, which is already being noted.
I want to bring up this point because it's been kind of bugging me of late, which is a lot of people seem to be trying to sweep too many SMEs into what you described earlier as the Scope 3 emission. And I think it is important to remember that the regulators intentionally did not roll out mandatory sustainability reporting to SMEs. It's just too burdensome. Mind you, that's what EU has just done in scoping back 95% of very large companies. It was because of the EU companies complaining of the administrative and reporting burden. But in ASEAN, I think we've got the regulatory balance right. Now, the issue though is, should we go after all SMEs to make them report just because they're in Scope 3? My view is no. And in speaking to a number of people who are in this space, no. But if they are material, even SME, for whatever reason is material to the risk that a larger company is reporting, then yes. But it's often a sort of, how would I put it? It's a bilateral willing buyer, willing seller relationship. You want to help your SME do the right thing and provide the right disclosure.
You're to thrive and to minimize harm and impact, right?
Absolutely. You're going to invest in the supply chain. If you take companies like Petronas, they routinely invest into their supply chain, not just for sustainability, but for various other reasons. And many other companies do the same. So I think that is got to be a factor that people start having the right balance. Don't overdo this. And if I may be a bit critical, I see a lot of people taking advantage of this opportunistic thing where they're trying to push products.
This deadline of sorts, right?
And including a whole bunch of SMEs. And I think we need to take the chill pill for a while because, honestly, the larger SMEs who are part of a material part of the value chain and risk to a listed company, great. Go ahead, you should do it. And honestly, if you're an SME, you should be thinking about this as a competitiveness lens, right?
A competitive edge, a business edge.
Absolutely.
Sharath, thank you for the conversation so far. We take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with the rest of this conversation only on Niaga Spotlight. Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight, still with me, Tamina Kausji, and today we're looking at COP30 and ASEAN, and in particular prioritizing sustainability data for businesses, of course, all around the region. Sharath, so continuing on with the conversation, now you've also highlighted three regional bottlenecks. There's fragmented standards, uneven regulation, and of course, the oft-repeated shortage of skilled preparers and assurers. Let's go into each of these sectorally.
Sure. So I think the first bit is around the whole fragmented reporting. And I think it would be useful to kind of remind ourselves where we are, right?
Yeah.
So today we have the global standard of the ISSB, which I spoke about. But in EU, they're using what they call as ESRS, which is the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And then there are other frameworks like the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, etc. Take a Malaysian or Indonesian or a Thai company. If they were to report under ISSB, but they still are a significant exporter or part of a value chain to Europe, they may have to report twice under a different standard. Now, to some, that may sound, well, that's unfortunately how business is. But I want us to go back a peg, which is in financial reporting, Tamina, there is only one standard. And that's the International Financial Reporting Standard, which governs the whole accounting space. So if we can have one standard on financial reporting, I see no reason why we can't scale this back, just like how our EU friends have scaled back and asked the world to converge to one. It's in ASEAN's interest that we can't keep being the ones where the reporting burden is being pushed to. We now have to learn how to flex as a supply chain and speak to our colleagues in EU and say, no, we need to start converging. So the fragmented standards is a big issue.
It is a big issue, and it does not seem like one which can be, which will resolve by itself. It will take a certain amount of perhaps even shareholder advocacy to be able to push this forward, right?
I think it's shareholder advocacy. It's also, I would call it policy-making advocacy. And what do I mean by that? So if you look at major policy-making bodies, and in particular I'm going to focus on, say, the ISSB again.
Sure.
There is no one on the board from ASEAN. Remember I talked about
That's a red flag.
670 million.
That's a red flag.
All of those things, right? If I go to other policy-making bodies like IMF and World Bank, you have a similar situation of very significant underrepresentation.
Sure.
So ASEAN needs to learn how it needs to dial up the policy-making advocacy and make sure we're at the seat of the table. Standard setting, Tamina, needs to be understood as part of policy making, because once standards are set, you've got to follow it, right? And we cannot just be recipients just because we've been recipients since our independence. It's time to be part of the game and to learn how to
climb that value chain, so to speak.
Shape the policies of the future. Our population demands it, our businesses demand it, we have a lot at stake, the climate risk, so yeah, we need to do something.
Absolutely. Now, I think that brings us to you being able to integrate the various parts of expertise that you are able to bring to the conversation, Sharath. Now, from your vantage point with WWF Malaysia, let's look at nature-related risks in particular. There's deforestation, water stress, amongst other, even biodiversity loss, all of which in different measures we are also experiencing in Malaysia and across the broader ASEAN landscape.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there are a few things I'd like to say here. Firstly, there was, in fact, and I'm going to quote a PwC study on this.
Sure.
It was about 2 years ago where they said about 55% of the world's GDP comes from nature, right? And if it's a very simple point I hope the business community gets. If that is your bread basket, then look after it. Biodiversity loss, deforestation, what we need to understand, which I don't think business people understand well enough, is the whole value chain. For example, why should we be concerned about just the tiger conservation? Yes, it's a species in which we are proud of as a Malaysian, but it's the apex species. And the apex species is the guardian of the entire health of the ecosystem below it. Lose that, and it tells you that the ecosystem below is unhealthy and it's going to be a little fragmented. What does that mean for companies which, basically make their money from agriculture? The products may be of lower quality, the volume of the products may get affected, and you're going to have all kinds of supply chain issues. Water is another issue that we should be thinking about, because water comes from the water cycle. The forest is a really important part of that water cycle. So there are a number of things I think the business world needs to lengthen its scope and understand.
Yeah, the expansive lens perhaps, and also that brings us to perhaps facing the reality, Sharath, maybe, that ASEAN businesses are maybe underestimating how quickly all of these environmentally anchored issues are actually going to become balance sheet issues and reflected very quickly in returns and gains, etc. It's not a bubble that can consistently continue expanding for infinity, right?
Yes. I would say a few things. And firstly, we just spoke about the ISSB, and they've come up with these two standards. One is general principles, the second was on climate. But they're already working on future standards, one of which is on biodiversity. It's a long word, sorry. Biodiversity, ecosystems, and its ecosystem services. Maybe, in short, we could say it's on nature, right? So, to the business world out there, they need to be expecting that there's going to be a future standard. Just like there is one on climate, there's going to be a future standard on nature.
Right.
Don't start preparing late and then end up on this whole, oh gosh, the regulators have gone into this compliance frenzy again. No, because of the point we made earlier, nature's your breadbasket. You should start looking at the dependencies and the impact that nature is having on you. Now, in WWF, we are part of the signatories to something called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and we're doing a study this year, Tamina, with 4 institutions around how would they be impacted by this reporting framework.
Right.
Because this reporting framework is going to be
very useful. By
ISSB.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so about next year, we'll be releasing those findings, and hopefully you'll give us an opportunity to come and share what those findings are. Because to your point, the ecosystem is being impacted. We need to talk about how we're dependent on it, and therefore our future income generation is going to be dependent on it and impacted, and how in turn we are impacting nature.
It's no longer a nice to have, it's a must have, because that's the only way in which life in its current form is able to perpetuate. Which brings us to the fact that when it comes to disclosures and sustainability reporting, right, it can also end up being awfully generic. What type of quality is being looked forward to, particularly, let's say, let's place the goalpost at roughly around 2030 now?
Well, I think we're already beginning to see what we call as illustrative type of sustainability reporting guidance that has been issued. I think the Securities Commission Malaysia has done that. I would expect that other regulators would be also providing these sort of guidance and advisory. I wouldn't use the word templates, but it's things that are out there that would help companies think about how not to be generic, because the issues in plantation is going to be very different from the issues in construction, and it cannot sound the same. And if I go back to my analogy with financial reporting, Tamina, no one can prepare their financial reporting on one industry and expect it is going to be the same on another.
Exactly.
Balance sheets will look very different. Sustainability disclosures will also look very different because of the industry. But we are at a stage where we're kind of getting off the starting block, so we don't have those examples just yet. But give it a year. I think December will be the first wave of Malaysian companies reporting. We would start to see how these disclosures are coming about. But also I would just remind our audience that some form of sustainability reporting, the voluntary frameworks, have already been used by major companies. So it's out there, it's not completely new, but we were not all following the same standard. Now, maybe I just want to make it very simple to the audience to understand. Why do we have one standard? Why should we have one standard? Because it creates one common language of trust. If you're using a different way of doing it, I'm using a different way of doing it, I'm going to have to spend so much time trying to figure out what you mean by your sustainability disclosures, and likewise.
Sure.
But if you're using one standard, same language, same trust.
And smoother transition and harmonization as
Yeah.
well. Sharath, let's land this conversation on an issue that you just spent a little bit more time on, which was very interesting from the top-down perspective, right? Looking at SMEs and the regulation around it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, whether or not all particular SMEs, especially the smaller ones, will be given the grace to be left outside of the scope remains to be seen. So what then would be the most realistic path to bring SMEs into compliance as a whole without overwhelming them? And what can, of course, then, you know, governments, auditors, and the major corporate representative stakeholders do to aid this?
Well, I think with SMEs, we have to be really careful about enforcing compliance issues on them. It has to go back to the fundamental business value of what they are doing in relation to how they are impacted by climate risk, and they themselves, their products or services are impacting another company which is say listed.
Yeah.
I think if we start placing, if you just take a step back and look at how regulators have designed the roadmap, they have carved out phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 based on larger listed companies, then the not so big ones, and it goes back down. With SMEs, in fact, even if you take Malaysia and their phase 3, it includes the very large non-listed companies which revenue is more than 2 billion.
Yes.
Right? So if you're that big, I think it's fair that you're caught in. But I'm now speaking of, you know, the majority of SMEs out there, which
The
are
MSMEs.
really, the MSMEs, which are really not that big. Tamina, I really hope they don't get caught into a compliance frenzy. They don't have that technological bandwidth, the investment, the infrastructure, or even the ability to attract talent. What they need to pivot to is understanding that this potentially is a business opportunity. If I'm developing a product and it's greener or it's more nature positive than another competitor, that's the angle I should focus on. I'll give you a very small example of a city in China.
Sure.
Which one of my colleagues in WWS board wrote about in The Age, and it's the city of Huzhou. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it, but in that ecosystem, there were 22,000 vendors.
Right.
Right? There were pretty much a lot of SMEs in there who had ESG ratings. Now, that allows them to have the ability to have credible information and products, which then the buyers of their products and services can decide, is this the type of company I want to do business with? I think that's where there's a real opportunity. I would just dial down on the need for them to be, you know, part of the whole mandatory reporting and compliance-driven initiatives.
Sharath, thank you so much for the conversation. It's been absolutely enlightening. Right. Well, when we look at ASEAN, credible reporting is now as critical as emissions cut themselves. Stronger data lowers risk, and weak data raises the cost of capital as well. The question, of course, for our region is simple. Are we investment ready? And with that, I'm Tamina Cowstreet signing off for now. Here's to a productive week ahead. We'll see you next time.